following program is underwritten by the Nevada Irrigation District. Since 1921, providing clean and healthy drinking and irrigation water to more than 24,000 homes, farms, schools, and businesses in Nevada and Placer counties.
Hello everyone, I'm your host Lou Sitzer. This is Nevada County Interviews, and this year we're entering our 6th year of doing the interview show. Usually I have someone sitting by my side to interview, but I thought this would be a little different, and instead I would tell a story dating back quite a few years in my life to give us some time to reflect on the war we're presently conducting both in Iraq and Afghanistan. So for me, it's going back to the Vietnam War, but prior to my involvement in it, I had been finishing college and I had come out of working in the South, the summer of 1964, which is noted as Mississippi Freedom Summer. It was the summer that 3 civil rights workers were killed, and things really started to happen on a national scale in the way of gaining people's attention to the problem of civil rights and beginning to make inroads with John Kennedy and Lyndon Johnson legislation from that point. Well, I came back from that summer to finish my college work. And even though in retrospect it seemed like a very successful time, it was really a very emotionally tough time where many people were jailed, threatened, beaten. The history is there, and I'm sure many of you know about it. I came back from that experience feeling like a casualty, and a college professor of mine suggested that I get some perspective on our country by leaving it and traveling some in the world, getting some experience, and looking back at our nation. So at that time, I was able to join an organization called International Voluntary Service. And I left for Washington, D.C. for a training program there where I learned Laotian in an 8-week intensive language program, and went to Laos. And during that time, the Vietnam War was starting up. We had, under the Kennedy administration, we had begun sending troops. The war was escalating. And at that time, I was given a choice of going to Laos or going to Vietnam. And since I was always already feeling like a casualty and needing some time to kind of get my bearings, I chose Laos, and I was placed in a very remote setting during that period of time, a 2-year stay. And my interest really was in learning about the world, learning about the culture of these people who were mostly Buddhist and animists, meaning that they believed in spirits occupying trees and vegetation, mountains, rocks. They believed in evil spirits and good spirits. And they also tied this in with Buddhism. And so I lived for a period of 2 years in a small village named Muang Palan, and a village of about 1,500 people. The job that I was trained to do somewhat was to be what was called a generalist, meaning I did a little bit of everything. So I helped to build medical dispensaries, very small ones, 1 cabin medical dispensaries, schools, helped to dig wells. I was a conduit for some supplies so that the villagers could focus their attention. And sometimes I'd be able to bring in cement or nails, sometimes tools. Nothing was electrified. Everything was very basic. And so that one of the things we'll do in the beginning here is look at their life and their culture, much the way I did when I visited and took up lodging there. So if we could look at first the map, which will give people an indication of where Laos is. It's entirely landlocked, surrounded by Thailand, Cambodia, what was then North and South Vietnam, and China. And so the only water route was the Mekong River, which I'm sure that people have heard about and made famous in movies. But in fact, we didn't live close to the Mekong River. We live quite central, and I think we have an arrow to point where it is. Quite central to the country. We had a river of our own, small river that increased during the monsoon season. And you can see the thick black line, which is near the arrow. That's the Ho Chi Minh Trail. I didn't realize it quite when I was posted there. It was a remote area posting, and it was within 20 kilometers of the Ho Chi Minh Trail, which is a major supply route for the North Vietnamese to bring army personnel supplies to South Vietnam. So in essence, trying to get away from the war, I got further into it. And this was a concern in the beginning, as I didn't know how dangerous it would be, but life on a village level was slow. It was easy. There was not much in the way of bombing and destruction when I arrived, but that escalated over time. And if we could look at the slides now that begin to show the life of the village, I can explain more about what my job was. It was really to begin to learn about the culture and the people. And here is the river. It's the river of Muang Palan. And if you can see, I don't know if you can see it, but there are animals, water buffalo, there are people there. It was our air conditioning. And so we bathed in the river daily with the animals to cool off. We washed our clothes and dishes. We drank water from the river, which I tried as fast as I could to help dig wells to promote safer water. So you could begin to see that the village life was really quite different from our own here, even 40 years ago when I was there. But we can go on to see that there are greater differences, as you can see that the villages were based on a hunting and gathering. The food was either in the trees or in the ground. Animals were sometimes hunted, sometimes raised. All of the constructions were totally recyclable. They washed out, bridges washed out during the monsoon seasons and were rebuilt again by bamboo. Houses were constructed from bamboo. It was a great material. Here we see the beast of burden, which is the water buffalo, used to help cultivate the rice paddies. Rice was their main food, and it was sticky rice, much different from what we are normally used to here. The ceremonies of the people were very touching. Here we're looking at a ceremony welcoming a child into the world and wishing the parents good luck. And you'll see the strings that are tied or when they're put on. You're wished many children and long life, many wives, because at this place you could marry, you could have more than one wife. And so it was a ceremony that happened throughout the time that I was there. And you can get a better view of it here. These bracelets became quite popular and sometimes are still seen in the United States today. It's a wonderful tradition. You carry the memory with you and just let it wear off in time. The village itself had about 1,500 people, and here you can see the child being welcomed and his mom and dad nearby. There was a lot of religion and also a lot of celebration. Here we are enjoying a meal. The meal most likely was sticky rice with a couple of vegetables and sometimes meat. An animal was killed. The meat was often raw. The blood was a delicacy to be eaten as well, once coagulated. Here is our morning market, so that I would go out each morning and shop for the day. As you'll see, the offerings are pretty simple, straightforward. It's a time where I lost a lot of weight, sometimes due to diet, sometimes illness. Because illness was prevalent. Malaria, dengue fever was all around. And the villagers survived, but lifespan was in the 40s, wasn't good. And so part of my job was to educate people about hygiene, to install the first toilet, not a flush toilet, but an outhouse type toilet. The kids were given great responsibilities because they could handle them. They were used to handling them. Sometimes they gathered food, took care of younger children, never saw anger directed towards children. Very hardworking people, but not a long work day. Their life was much simpler than ours, and here they're hulling the rice hulls away from the kernels, and then they'll put them in baskets, throw them in the air, and the hulls will blow away and left with the rice kernels. And so rice was the main diet, and again, the diet was simple, and it was a country that, because of life's simplicity, had a great deal of leisure. They had one crop that they grew, rice, and the women and children grew it extensively. Men sort of had a privileged position in society. They didn't do a lot of the work. And they did a lot of the celebrating. Everything was made, including the rice whiskey, in the village level. As I was saying that, I worked in the main village of Muang Palan of about 1,500, but there were many surrounding villages, and what I did was assist the surrounding villages in initiating a project and helping to support the project. While this happened, I also got better with the language, but never great. So the kids nearby who were not permitted in the school, and I'll go into that a little later, who were not permitted into the school, came to my house, and I taught them how to read and write, since it was a fairly simple language to read and write. They taught me how to better speak the language. And for a year or more, we learned together. It was great fun. They actually felt it was very unusual for a person such as myself to be alone. And so they often came during the day, sent by their parents sometime to keep me company. Not that I was at home a lot. I was actually most of the time away doing various projects with surrounding villages. But another thing they did, because I was a good foot taller than everyone and quite a bit hairier, was that they came and sat with me, and they would sometimes massage or feel my arms because I was quite hairy compared to them. Asians, at least Laotians, had very little, almost no body hair. So I was an oddity at many levels. And what I started to do more of as I saw the need, was to develop projects that were relevant to the people. For instance, when we had refugees come in as the war began to increase in intensity and people from the Ho Chi Minh Trail area, the mountains, the Hmong and other tribes came into our village and were not particularly welcome. They spoke a slightly different dialect. They weren't of the village. So the kids didn't have a village school, and the adults didn't have a village where they could grow rice. So what I did as beginning with a garden project is I started the idea of building ways in which the refugees could be more self-sufficient. So we should go on to the slides that deal with the life that surrounded me. And here, a refugee is coming back from the river where she was gathering water for their daily consumption. Again, no motor vehicles, no electricity, no refrigeration. Everything was day to day. You can begin to see the refugee life was poor. Village life was a little better than this, but the refugees surrounded me in what was an abandoned army barracks. And so I lived in one of the dwellings, like you see here, off the ground because of the rainy seasons, and got to know these kids and provided ways in which they could supplement their food. And here they are looking for their next meal. I mean, this is really hand to mouth, day to day, living off the land, and anything that moved was life to be eaten. So you can begin to see how primitive this is, and really probably a lot of parallels with the lives of people in remote areas of war anywhere in the world. People are reduced to survival, bare survival. And so this really gives you an idea of the level at which people people move. There are also construction projects that I worked on that are pictured, and we'll hopefully be able to look at some of those. What we built were a lot of small village schools, and also here's the beginning of our garden, which you can see. Starting really from nothing, building the fences, enlisting as many of the village refugees, building fences that were not usual because there was never any reason to keep animals away. Here we're using raised beds because of the rainy season. And we grew a lot of vegetables that were strange to the people because they were used to foraging. So when we grow string beans or lettuce or cabbage, or we even grew peanuts, we grew a wide variety of whatever seed I was able to get a hold of, and began to educate people as to what else could be grown to supplement their diet. And I look back on this because this was my first real gardening experience. And since this time, I've continued as a gardener to this very day, enjoying planting and growing things that we eat every day. And so this was a great joy to me to work on. I was learning a great deal and helping others. And here you can begin to see the construction of schools. This was volunteer labor that each village provided. They sawed the wood from adjacent trees and participated. I would visit weekly to be sure things were on schedule, delivering what needed to be. You can see the tools are very primitive. These are made from brake spines from automobiles and ground down. There is an auto in the background, but mostly just to bring in supplies. Here's the biggest school that we were able to build, which was in the village of Muang Palan, and it was a 3-room classroom that was really going to help the village a lot. And as you can see, it enlisted a lot of labor from the villagers here. Even villagers from adjacent villages were sent in to help. Again, all volunteer. and done at a minimal cost. We, I think, brought in some tin for the roofs. What I learned is that IVS, International Voluntary Service, even though it was international in scope, in Laos it was under contract with the United States Agency for International Development, USAID. And it took me quite a while to learn that this project, the IVS project in Laos, was part of the overall war effort to win the hearts and minds of the local people. And I could see it was doing that and helping them as well. So it had kind of a two-pronged effect. I realized that more and more my efforts were seen as a Western American effort to aid villagers, and as a result it began to be seen as partisan. The good work that we were doing there was viewed by Laotians, and particularly the opposition forces, the Pathet Lao, as being undermining their own efforts to win the hearts and minds of people, much like what is going on in Iraq today and Afghanistan. You see battles between what's happening, struggles between what's happening at the governmental level and also where we're assisting, and what's happening with opposition. That these forces, once confronted with one another, begin to mount in scale and momentum and impact, to where the war more and more began to approach the village. We could see it nightly with flares that were lit the skies of the Ho Chi Minh Trail, and bombers would come in and drop these bombs that would shake the earth, and further refugees would come. And what I found was that more and more my own life, my own work, and those around me were more and more impacted by the war. And of course this presented more problems to us. And we can begin to see the tragedy begin to unfold in our own village. And here was our lovely village. What you can begin to see is a bomb crater right there in front of the chief's house. Now, we were a friendly village. I was there, I mean, as an American. We were very surprised by this mistake that I interpreted to be a mistake. I don't see any reason why it was purposeful, because we were working there, and yet the village was literally destroyed. Jet fighters came in on an early morning when kids were going to school, and bombs were dropped, 18 bombs. It doesn't sound like a lot, but these were 2,000 to 3,000 pound bombs that were laid down strategically on the village, and then blew up. Some immediately, some over a delayed period of time, and that the effect was to drive us into the forest, which was what the Ho Chi Minh Trail bombs were intended to do: disrupt transportation, disrupt the what was happening on the ground level. And as you can see, the village was destroyed. People were very upset. First time I'd ever seen anger, and justifiably so. So we left for a period of 2 weeks where we lived in the forest and then hid out while the bombs dropped. So I took photographs. I was upset. I tried to explain to people what the mistakes were being made. I sent them off home, and it was intercepted by the U.S. Embassy. The ambassador called me up and said, look, we can't have this. These kind of photographs will be bad for the war effort. And he gave me a choice of staying in the country and helping rebuild, or being sent home. And so I chose to stay. I felt terribly responsible and guilty for what my country had done. And helped to rebuild until a time where my neighbor, Fred Cheidler, in the adjacent village was assassinated. He was doing the same work I was doing about 20 kilometers away. And the guerrillas came through one night under his home and shot through him with a machine gun, riddled the place with machine gun bullets, killed him while he slept. And so that was a pretty big shock to me. It was a terrible loss of a great human being and caused me to reflect upon my place in the war, and that this was a time where I had to look at what was happening to Laos, what was happening to the village, tried to make sense out of the chaos of what I saw as huge forces interplaying in the lives of innocent people, making no sense to what was happening, and beginning to see my work as useless, futile, waste of lives, leading to, as you can see, the tragedy that they lived with and continue to live with for another 7 or so years as the war slowly came to a close. So I'm relating this story to you to give you a sort of a look at the consequences of war. It's not a pretty picture, as we have been seeing with our own wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. To me, it was a total breakdown in communication, and I see diplomacy as a way in which to engage with people, because once you start a war, it's difficult to get out of, and forces at play begin to escalate in ways that we cannot control. So I came back to this country a little short of my 2-year contract. I felt that my life was not worth sacrificing in this conflict. And I think that historians will support that point of view, even though we lost 58,000 Americans and many, many more Laotians. So at this time, what I did find out was that Americans are very good at certain things and very good at solving problems, not particularly good at understanding cultures, understanding others' ways of life, and communicating with those folks. So I want to encourage you at this beginning of this year to take heart that we are a very capable, very hard-working people who can accomplish a great deal once we rediscover our common purpose and learn to work together. So thanks for watching. Thanks to our great crew. And I want to thank also NID for its loyal support as an underwriter for this show. And again, thanks to Samantha and Gail and Diane and Jenna and Marilyn for being such a wonderful crew, and has helped me to tell you this story. Hopefully we'll have a good year ahead of us.